The following presentation is from PBS Home Video.
"1943 was the year the members of the Grand Alliance, the Soviet Union, Britain, and the United States, stamped the certainty of their victory on the course of the World War. The great tank battle at Kursk, fought during a furious week in mid-1943, confirmed the harsh lessons of Stalingrad. It is during this year that the world first hears of an event that would haunt the Soviet Union through and beyond my own tenure as Secretary of State: the massacre of Polish officers in the Katyn forest. 1943 was also the year when the big three Allied leaders met at Tehran, at this first meeting of Stalin and Roosevelt. The American president made a determined effort to reassure Stalin of the goodwill of the United States. But of course, as even the Russian makers of this episode now accept, it was not the goodwill of the United States which was at issue.
March 1943. The Red Army's great victory at Stalingrad has lit a beacon of hope for the Soviet people. The tide of war is turning. At last, Stalin's troops begin the long drive west. Even the very young are swept up in a new wave of popular determination. For these children, orphaned by war, the Soviet motherland is their only parent. When the time comes, they are prepared to stand and fight alongside their fellow countrymen and defend her to the last. Their childhood dreams sacrificed at the altar of war. These boys yearn only to join the victorious troops they idolize. What can they know of the dull, squalid reality that is frontline existence, punctuated only by moments of terror and horror? Little boys, no more than 8 or 9 years old, flock to new military schools all over the Soviet Union. Like the Alexander Suvorov Academy, named after Catherine the Great's favorite general. Here they are groomed for battle, schooled in military drill, spoon-fed the ideal of patriotic self-sacrifice. These boys are lucky. This war will be over before they're big enough to wield machine guns or steer tanks into enemy fire. But time and age are not on the side of these recruits. Though they have fought and survived the Battle of Stalingrad, their commanders can permit them no rest. Instead, they must struggle on through the late winter blizzards, instruments of their supreme commander's lust for glory. Stalin has sampled victory at Stalingrad, and he wants to taste it again. He cares nothing for the lives of ordinary soldiers. He is bent only on burnishing his name with the luster reserved for history's mightiest warlords. From early February, Stalin orders new offensives all along the southern fronts. The Red Army drives deep into Nazi-held territories, fighting exhaustion, cold, mud. And in the skies, the protective umbrella of the Red Air Force, beating back Luftwaffe resistance and pounding German troop positions. Inch by inch, the infantry advances. Reclaiming lands devastated by retreating Germans. Rescuing communities shattered by the agonies of occupation. Now it is safe to come out of hiding, and there is work to be done in the newly liberated lands. Children must be fed. And they must be schooled, taught something of life among the ruins. But for older children, the call to war is irresistible. At the Red Navy's Northern Fleet School, some cadets already wear battle decorations. Soviet youth is champing at the bit, signaling its readiness for the fight against Germany. 30 years on, their boyish enthusiasm barely dimmed, survivors revisit the school.
Right here. This is where the entrance was, where the stone is. This is the first dugout, and this is the second. This is it, this is it.
This is the entrance.
Yes, this is the entrance to the dugout, to the first one.
Well, it's all been cleared away now.
Really brings back memories.
It certainly does.
Didn't see him all those years ago.
Yeah, seems more like yesterday.
Well, this is where the dugout starts, and this is the entrance to the dugout. This is where we had a sort of parade ground set out with stones in a kind of path.
Well, even the parade ground's overgrown. You know, the one where we used to drill in front of the dugouts. We nearly didn't find it because it was overgrown with trees.
Red Army recruits board their trains for the front in the spring of 1943. They are destined to take part in one of history's bloodiest battles. Russian author Bulat Okujawa was among them.
Мы едем на фронт впервые. Я весь сотрясаюсь, я не могу спать.
We were on our way to the front for the first time. I was shivering all over, and I couldn't get any sleep on the troop train. I couldn't sleep because I was on my way to fight at the front. They'd issued us with a carbine each, as well as a uniform. So I had a carbine and an ammunition belt. Everyone was asleep, but I couldn't sleep. Finally, the train stopped somewhere in the middle of the night, and I climbed out of my carriage, out of the cattle truck, and started to walk the length of it, up and down with my carbine at the ready, although nobody had given me an order to do this. Later, I was stopped and told to go and get some sleep, but I couldn't. I had to play the part of a real soldier.
He is not alone. Many share his anxiety and anticipation. They all realize the Red Army is being built up for a massive offensive. Former paratrooper Konstantin Vanchenkin.
The army was getting younger, and with each year the interval between drafts got shorter and shorter. For example, I was called up in year 10 at school, just after the second term, because I'd just turned 17. And of course, you know, the younger they were, the more likely they were to die at the front. They were completely ill-prepared for it, physically and in every way. Of course, they were full of so-called spirit. They had that in abundance. But they were gradually getting younger and younger.
And mass recruitment is not the only sign that some great confrontation is surely coming. As the Red Army's manpower mushrooms, an enormous national effort is mounted to provide it with weapons and supplies. The mass transfer of Soviet industrial assets from the war-torn west to safe locations east of the Urals, begun in 1941, is almost complete by the start of 1943. It has been an epic achievement, enabling Soviet heavy industry to reach stupendous production targets. As conscription drains the labor force, women fill more and more vital factory jobs. Their one all-important priority, weapons production. And Stalin's iron hand ensures unprecedented growth in output. Gulag prisoners are used to build new factories, and conscripted laborers, sometimes working 20-hour shifts, know that to be caught slacking for just 1 minute can mean a whole year's imprisonment under Stalin's law. By now, the Soviet war machine is producing weapons of the highest quality. Summer's approach finds massed fleets of modern Stumovik ground attack planes and Petlyakov bombers ready for action, along with thousands of the highly successful T-34 and KV tanks, now modified for maximum efficiency and versatility. The same desperate race to prepare is underway in Germany, where much is expected of 2 new heavy tanks, the fearsome Panthers and Tigers. Both are being rushed into service for action in the east. German aircraft output has stepped up, though the Luftwaffe is denied new designs in favor of rapid production. And as Hitler orders the German people to a new total war footing, almost 1 million workers are transferred into the army. But Hitler dare not focus on a single theater of war. Germany must have defenses against Anglo-American bombing attacks. It needs submarines for the desperate battle in progress across the world's sea lanes. And Germany must send troops to bolster its faltering allies. The Führer knows that if his stretched forces are to defeat the Red Army in 1943, they must attack quickly before it can recover from the losses of the winter. Hitler's strategy is simple and optimistic. In a two-pronged attack, he plans to destroy the Soviet position around Kursk. On the map, a great bulge, 130 miles long and 100 miles deep, at the center of the Eastern Front. The people of the steppe around Kursk inhabit a natural granary, a prize contested by successive invaders through the centuries. Mongols, Napoleon's armies, White Russians, all have fought for this land. It is an obvious target for a German offensive. As the snows melt in the spring of 1943, Hitler expects to seize the grain fields and to eliminate any possibility of a Red Army attack. But Stalin's fierce determination to increase the strength of the Red Army and its supply lines means that the Wehrmacht now faces a formidable foe. Moscow in April. Intelligence is flooding into the Kremlin from the Kursk sector. Coordinated by Deputy Chief of Staff Antonov, it gives an increasingly accurate picture of German intentions. For Stalin's General Staff, this is a rare opportunity for finesse. They plan to contain the German offensive by constructing deep defenses stretching tens of miles behind the front, and then to crush the Wehrmacht with massive Red Army counterattacks. At first, Stalin instinctively rejects this strategy. As usual, he demands an immediate offensive. But Deputy Supreme Commander Zhukov and Red Army Chief of Staff Vasilevsky advise against it. And as he is at last learning to do, Stalin heeds the counsel of his best generals. Soviet units are ordered to dig in and defend Kursk, massed to draw the Wehrmacht into a trap. And so now, two gigantic armies are converging, led by men who hold the destinies of huge empires in their hands. On the German side, Field Marshal Kluge commands forces allocated for the northern pincer. The dauntless Manstein will control the southern offensive. On the Soviet side, Rokossovsky leads the northern sector, and Stalin appoints General Vatutin to lead the southern defense. The vital reserve army group, reinforcing them both, is entrusted to Konev. The blueprints for battle have been laid down. Now it is a matter of waiting. And waiting. And waiting. Weeks pass. Soviet soldiers lie in their trenches expecting attack at any time. Tense days. But at least the Red Army's fledgling formations are granted time to learn crucial battle skills.
Было, конечно, было и до этого, потому что мы в обороне долго были. Это, считай, февраль, март, апрель.
Of course it was frightening, because we were in reserve for so long. Let's work it out. February, March, April, May, so for 4 to 5 months. We didn't even know how to use a rifle. But while we were in reserve, the old hands taught us everything about weapons, light and heavy machine guns and so on, and submachine guns. Well, it was very frightening, but war is war.
April, May, June. Hitler can only fume as his attack is repeatedly postponed because the new tanks are not ready. But every delay is a military blessing for the Soviet Union. And now, as early summer warms the steppes, Soviet troops at Kursk receive another kind of blessing. The Kursk Madonna, discovered by a 13th century peasant in the roots of a tree. For 7 centuries, according to local legend, the Madonna stood guard over the region and its people, protecting them from harm. A monastery was built on the site of the tree, an important shrine. In 1917, the monastery and its Madonna fell victim to a revolution with no use for icons or religious worship. the Madonna was lost and its home taken over by the NKVD, who turned it into a holiday camp. But in 1943, as the hour of decision approaches, custom and religion are revived under the stress of war, and a copy of the Madonna is presented to Rokossovsky's troops. A symbol of shared struggle, of ancient glories beyond even Stalin's power to purloin. A talisman to ease the burden of their deadly waiting game. But now, as the armies swelter in high summer, the waiting is almost over. The greatest tank battle of all time is about to begin. The 4th of July. A Soviet raiding party brings vital news. Under interrogation, a German prisoner gives full details of the Wehrmacht's plans. The German offensive, Operation Citadel, will begin that night. The tension reaches a new climax now. Every unit on both sides is at the peak of readiness, and a deathly quiet falls over the front lines. Word of the planned attack is rushed to Stalin. But still, the gigantic armies wait. With 3,500 tanks and 19,000 guns at their backs, 1.3 million Soviet troops hold their breath. Across the lines, 1 million German troops can call on 2,700 tanks, 10,000 guns. Yet on the eve of battle, as Rokossovsky's memoirs tell, this vast array is so quiet that a dripping tap sounds like an alarm bell. Until, at midnight, the unnatural calm is ruptured by a massive Soviet artillery strike. As the ground shakes and the cauldron of Kursk comes at last to the boil, Soviet shells and rockets disrupt final German preparations, and Operation Citadel suffers one last delay. It is an ill omen for the panzer armies. Their best units are eventually on the attack by morning. But Soviet resurgence has been underestimated by the German High Command. Reinforcements are already rushing to threatened areas, and the confident German advance soon becomes a crawl. For almost a week, Soviet tanks confront German in an awesome clash of armor. Battle's epicenters are searing furnaces, engulfing millions of men, women and boys in a hideous bedlam of noise, dust and death.
Ну почему? Потому что осколок, столько понравилось, была такая битва, там выпущено, не знаю, там миллионы снарядов и бомб.
There was so much shrapnel. It was a battle with millions of bombs and shells and so much shrapnel. There's still a lot of it there. Disarmed mines and shells, that sort of thing. You know what I mean. On the 5th and 6th of July, our division was very much in the thick of things. We lost 2,500 men in just 2 days. We were finally pulled back to the village of Berezovets to be reinforced. And only on the 12th do we go back into the attack.
And above the nightmare on the ground, the air fleets do battle. Almost 3,000 Soviet warplanes and some 2,000 German machines, dealing sudden death to ground forces. And to each other. The 12th of July. A great barrage of Katyusha rockets and artillery announces counter-offensives by 4 more Soviet armies sweeping around the rear of the battered German divisions. The battle that follows is another massive infantry struggle. And every available Soviet aircraft is called upon to help drive the Luftwaffe from the skies. But above all, it is another cataclysmic clash of tanks. This is the day of the tank. The land war between Germany and the Soviet Union is the definitive armored conflict in human history. And Kursk, its appalling climax. Germany's vaunted Panthers and Tigers are the most powerful tanks in the world, but they are relatively few. Though the fighting is, if anything, even more intense in this second stage of the battle, Soviet T-34s and KVs remain masters of the battlefield. On the 13th of July, Hitler abandons hopes of a quick victory at Kursk, and German offensive operations are halted. The Führer's eastern commanders are instructed to hold the Red Army at bay, but it is too late. The trap is closing. The Wehrmacht can only retreat. It leaves behind the mangled debris of war. Battle zones littered with charred and broken tanks, and the bodies of hundreds of thousands of men. For survivors of this savage inferno, shattered, shell-shocked, stunned by the horrors they have witnessed, there can be no joy. On the 5th of August, Soviet forces retake the cities of Orel and Belgorod. It is the climax to a stunning victory. Citizens pour from their homes to welcome the liberators, and victory celebrations throng the streets. In Moscow, triumphant artillery salutes announce the city's liberation and the Red Army's decisive defeat of the invaders. The world must be told of Stalin's victories, although they belong in truth to the whole Soviet people. The dictator's glory has been bought with the blood of ordinary men and ordinary women, like Leningrad's female firefighters performing full-time rescue work in the besieged city. Like the anti-aircraft gunners at their stations all over the Western Soviet Union. Or like Anna Kovalyova, bomb disposal expert, credited with single-handedly disarming 42 bombs. For Anna Kovalyova and her comrades in home defense units, there is little enough time for relaxation. And even fewer moments of peace for Soviet women in frontline roles. Ground crew, medical personnel, and drivers like Elena Ivanova.
I was passing the conscription office, and an officer was sitting on the windowsill. His son was at the kindergarten where I worked, and he said, "Ivanovna, are you going to join up?" And I said, "Yes, I'll join up." He was laughing, and so was I, and he said, "I'm not joking, I'm being serious." And so I said, "I'll join up." I went to the conscription office, and they said, "Get yourself ready for the army." And at lunchtime, they sent us off.
To be trained as a driver?
Yes, and almost the whole time I used to drive air crews to and from the mess. If there were no vehicles available, then I'd be put on to transport the bombs to the planes.
On the 1.5-ton truck?
Yes. And I used to paint the bombs with any other girls who were free. One day we'd paint the bombs sky blue, and on another day with stripes like a tiger. They always had some sort of camouflage. Every day the girls who drove the tractors used to level the ground to make it easier for the planes to land and take off.
50 years on, she can still handle a jeep. These stories have their parallels in the West, but Soviet women are also expected to play a full part in combat operations. These are the pilots of the Marina Raskova night bomber squadron. Their old wooden U-2 biplanes are slow and fragile, known as oil stoves. But they are stable and quiet, ideal for precision low-level attack. The regiment is successful enough to earn a German nickname, the Night Witches.
We flew without parachutes, so of course people were burned alive along with their planes. But our spirits never dropped, and no one questioned why we were there. I myself succeeded in completing 852 military missions during the entire war. And I'll never forget flying in the Kuban, because it was there that we lost more pilots than anywhere else. I flew up to the target and delivered my bombs. There were explosions and shells were bursting everywhere, which meant we'd hit the warehouse. But at that moment, 5 searchlights switched on. Then, night fighters entered the fray, guns blazing. The enemy threw everything at us that night, and 4 complete crews were killed in one mission. That was our heaviest loss of the whole war. In one night, so many pilots.
As the autumn unfolds, the Red Army will bury many more dead heroes. This is the funeral of Maria Oktoberskaya. She raised public subscriptions to buy a tank and volunteered for training as its driver. Killed in action near Smolensk, she's given a hero's send-off. Kiev, so long enslaved by Nazi occupation, beckons the Red Army now. And so it must resume the long road west, into the Ukraine, to the mighty Dnieper River and beyond. And as they sweep towards the western borders, there are many more victims of Hitler's tyranny to be freed. Terrible proofs of his genocidal madness to be unveiled, like the bodies of Ukrainian miners tossed down shafts for refusing to cooperate with the German regime. Soviet authorities broadcast details of Nazi crimes to fan the flames of hatred against the invader. But there is so much grief, and the occupied lands have seen so much senseless slaughter that these people need no advertisement of their tragedy beyond their own simple memorial. It is a song to inspire a whirlwind of Red Army revenge, as it strikes now against the mighty barrier of the Dnieper River. The first troops to reach the river are easy targets for the Luftwaffe. And the Dnieper could delay the Red Army for months, as the Rhine will later halt the British Army in the west. Witnesses will describe it as a river of blood, bloated with the corpses of drowned soldiers. The battle is most intense north and south of Kiev itself, where German defenders hold commanding heights on the west bank. But the Red Army is permitted no hesitation. As German air strength dwindles, Soviet troops swarm out of the water, charging from their beachheads up the hill and into the Viper's Nest. They are across the length of the river before the Wehrmacht is able to secure its defenses, but they pay a high price for their courage. Of the 11,000 wartime soldiers awarded the USSR's highest battle honor, Hero of the Soviet Union, almost half win their medal at the Dnieper. Now, once more, the Red Army is in pursuit of a retreating enemy and racing towards the year's climactic conquest. Towards Kiev, capital of the Ukraine. As winter draws near, Stalin sees Kiev as the crowning glory of his fabulously successful year. He wants the city at any cost. And he wants it before the 7th of November, anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. Both sides pay a huge price for the satisfaction of Stalin's whim. More than 500,000 soldiers and citizens die in the battle for the city. Vatutin's tanks enter Kiev on the 6th of November, just one day before Stalin's deadline. It is a battered prize, a scene of appalling devastation to rank with the worst bombing atrocities in the West, a city in ruins. On the evening of the 6th, 700 miles away in Moscow, artillery rings out in triumph once more. And that same night, Stalin delivers his annual anniversary address to the nation.
In honor of the 26th anniversary of the Great October Socialist Revolution, a report is to be presented by Comrade Stalin, chairman of the State Defense Committee.
He will speak as usual from the Kremlin Palace, and his entrance is carefully staged. He remains out of sight at the back of the podium. The applause must reach a frenzied crescendo before he will step out in front of his people. Stained with the blood of countless Soviet soldiers and citizens, Stalin assumes the mantle of victorious warlord for the first time. He is no orator, no Churchill or Hitler. In rough Georgian tones, he will grind out the few words he needs. But he oozes power.
Comrades, all the peoples of the Soviet Union are now celebrating the 26th anniversary of the Great October Socialist Revolution. For the third time, our country celebrates the anniversary of its people's revolution in this, the third year of the Great Patriotic War. The year that has passed since the last anniversary has been the turning point in the Patriotic War. It is the turning point because this year the Red Army, for the first time in the whole war, has managed to put into effect a major summer offensive against the German forces, in which the German troops, under the heavy onslaught of our armies, were forced to withdraw at speed from the territories which they had seized. At times, to avoid encirclement, they have had to retreat so fast that they have left behind them on the battlefield vast amounts of equipment, ammunition, wounded officers and men. So the success of our summer campaign in the second half of this year can be seen as the continuation and completion of our winter campaign at the beginning of this year. Now that the Red Army has followed the successes of its winter campaign with a powerful blow against the German forces in the summer, we can consider dead and buried the old myth that the Red Army is not capable of carrying out successful offensives in summertime.
Stalin talks of victories and armies, but never of victims or people. He gives no thought to those he calls the little cogs in the mechanism, the men and women whose blood has paid for his victories. They know that a chasm separates them from the dictator.
Вы знаете, в окопах, в перерывах, я не помню, чтобы шли разговоры о Сталине.
I don't remember us talking about Stalin at all in the trenches, in the lulls between fighting. At meetings, of course, they used to shout slogans, but I don't remember soldiers talking about him among themselves. He was somewhere up there, the leader, the celestial being, unapproachable. And of course, if anyone asked me, I would say completely sincerely that he was a genius, that he was our leader, and that he would lead us to victory. That used to happen, but he had no place in the normal run of things. We used to talk about our past, about bread, about potatoes, and whatever else we could get our hands on, or how to grab a couple of moments of sleep.
Raised to new heights at home, Stalin's reputation has also soared on the international stage. In Britain, they have forged a sword, a gift to the victor of Stalingrad from King George. Yet one dark deed could still undermine Stalin's newfound global status. Earlier in 1943, at Katyn forest near Smolensk, German occupying authorities had unearthed the mass graves of 20,000 Polish officers. International observers were invited to support Berlin's claim that the murders were carried out by the NKVD, but Stalin had reacted furiously, denying any link with the massacres. Posterity will reveal that he is steeped in the blood of these helpless victims. But when Allied leaders meet in Tehran, Churchill and Roosevelt must swallow their doubts and suspicions. They can only back their most important ally in the face of outraged protest from exiled Poles. And so Stalin is spared the backlash he fears from the atrocities at Katyn. His sword is presented, and Stalin stands as an undisputed world leader, backed by the most powerful army ever seen. Now, as he accepts the laurels for Kursk and the Dnieper, Stalin can insist that the Allies open a second front in Europe next year. And now he can turn all his energies to the vengeful crusade that has fueled his spectacular regeneration. To the total destruction of his archenemy in Berlin. But as Stalin's year of rebirth comes to an end, what of the little cogs whose willing partnership has granted him glory? For them, the struggle continues, and winter snows bring no more than a pause for rest and reflection. Their song, a lament from the dugouts, speaks of future battles and future loss. A tiny flame still flickers in the campfire here, and for every glowing ember I have shed a tear. As I cower in this dugout, an accordion softly cries, singing of your smile and the color of your eyes. As wind whispers through the bushes, it seems to speak your name. And from snow-white fields near Moscow, my love is mixed with pain. I long to hear your own voice, and for you to hear mine, telling you how desperately I miss you all the time. The great victories of 1943 have raised the Red Star to new heights. As the year ends, the people of Moscow can afford a modest celebration. But for many others, Soviet citizens and their neighbors, still suffering under a brutal German occupation, the waiting seems to be without end, for some without hope. In Moscow, Joseph Stalin underlines his power with the peasant cruelty he most enjoys. He requires the sad figure of Kalinin, the Soviet Union's nominal head of state, to read a New Year message. In government circles, it is well known that his wife is in a camp, arrested by Stalin 7 years ago. But Kalinin is Stalin's marionette, dancing for his master's amusement, nurturing his dreams. But as the bell tolls the momentous New Year of 1944, the Red Army is already giving substance to those dreams. In the far north, new offensives launched against German positions during December and January leave little room for doubt. Red Army has the measure of the Wehrmacht. And as they battle to rescue towns and villages from occupation, their objective is Leningrad, besieged for nearly 900 days through 3 bleak winters. Since 1941, the extraordinary courage of the people of Leningrad has surmounted the agonies of bombardment, cold, and starvation, but at a cost of nearly 2 million lives. And when the Red Army at last breaks the siege on the 19th of January 1944, it sends a signal round the world. This is the year of victories. And for Stalin, the year of opportunity.
With God's aid, our sacred Russian army has driven the fascist German army from our holy motherland. God help our troops and help them in their task ahead.
Confidence, patriotism, grim determination now combine to galvanize the Soviet people for a final effort. In the cities where something like normal life returns as the threat of German air raids recedes, the rail stations hum with the throng of refugees going home. To the hero city of Leningrad, home to a devastated town or village, to bury their dead. Yet even as the Red Army pushes forward the line of liberation, striking towards the Baltic states in the north, retaking Zhytomyr in the Ukraine, and encircling 6 German divisions at Korsun, the cause millions believe they are fighting for is being betrayed from within. Joseph Stalin sees the liberation of new territory as no other mortal sees it. Uppermost in his mind is the corroding fact that all these millions in the lands of Caucasia, in the Crimea, in Belorussia, and above all in the Ukraine, have been in contact with the enemy, the foreigner. No matter that it was not their choice, no matter that the depth of the German advance was to a large extent the direct responsibility of Stalin himself, all people who have suffered occupation are suspect, tainted. In victory, Stalin now turns to a monstrous form of collective punishment, which he first used in the days just before the German attack. Professor Naumov of the Committee for Victims of Political Repression.
The experimental use of this kind of operation against whole peoples first took place in the 30s. Back in the 30s, the western frontiers were shifting all the time. So were some of the eastern ones, mind you. But anyway, in the 30s, a Polish operation was carried out. Tens of thousands of Poles from the border regions were forcibly resettled in the Irkutsk region. And all the Koreans who had lived inside the far eastern frontiers were transported to Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. In 1940 to 41, they deported tens of thousands of people from the Baltic states.
Now Stalin turns his attention to the northern Caucasus, the home of people like the Ingushi, the Balkars, and the Chechens. They're people with their own distinctive mountain culture, whose lifestyle and traditions have never fitted comfortably into the narrow concept of the Soviet state. No doubt to many of these North Caucasian peoples, the arrival of German forces in the summer of 1942 was an opportunity to revert to their traditional pre-Soviet way of life, and undoubtedly some actively collaborated. But with the return of the Soviet forces in 1944, the mountain peoples, Ingushi, Balkars, and above all Chechens, are rounded up in dawn raids of new horror, Mobile NKVD units are sent into the hills. Whole peoples, uncomprehending of their guilt, are marked down for punitive deportation.
Каждый такой акт осуществлялся таким образом. Вообще приурачивали выселение.
Each of these actions would be carried out to coincide with some kind of state celebration. Red Army Day, the 8th of March, that kind of thing. Well, on the eve of a public holiday, they would round up the men and send them to some kind of camp or holding unit. They'd be escorted there under heavy guard. The rest of the community, the old men, women and children, would follow in different trains with fewer guards. The mortality rate was much higher in these second groups. They were often transported to a different republic altogether. For example, they might be taken to Kyrgyzia, Kazakhstan and the Altai. After they got there, it would be at least a few months, often a whole year or more before they would even start to reunite families. Of course, the whole story is a tragedy.
It is the tragedy of a small nation in the hands of a vast and ruthless state. They're dragged from their homes, their lifestyle destroyed, leaving whole areas empty of any inhabitants. And when German troops are driven from the Crimea in May, Stalin is convinced the Tatar people have been guilty of collaboration with the enemy. He immediately dissolves the Muslim Autonomous Republic of the Crimean Tatars and punitively deports 400,000 people, men, women and children. And beyond the misery of shocked and frightened people, the disregard for military needs. This is a time when the Soviet forces need all the transport they can get. Every truck they can muster to maintain the pursuit of the German army at the front.
If we examine all the atrocities committed by those former leaders in the NKVD and the NKGB, even a fraction of what is known to us, it makes my blood run cold. As for what they've done, I think there should be charges brought against them for all the crimes they've committed.
Hundreds and hundreds of thousands of innocent refugees from the occupied territories will be transported to the Gulag after their liberation, contaminated by mere proximity to German authorities. Yet still, Stalin's phobias remain hidden by the fog of war. Though his war economy is growing fast, Stalin still has need of the West. These are America's Liberty ships, built with mass production methods, multiplying Allied shipping capacity. The flow of aid to the Soviet Union remains a crucial source of supplies. Weapons, of course, shells, and tanks. But by 1944, Britain and America can't match the quality of Soviet tank design, and Stalin's real priorities are food to sustain his armies and trucks to deliver it in. As long as the Allies have faith in the myth of Uncle Joe, of a leader and his people undivided, they will give all they possibly can. Plagued by foul weather, icy waters, U-boats, German bombers, the Arctic run costs the Allies dozens of ships and thousands of seamen's lives. As they battle through to Murmansk or Archangel, how can these ordinary British and American seamen guess that Stalin fears them as carriers of forbidden ideas? They come in friendship, but Churchill has long suspected the truth. The Soviets fear our friendship, he says, more than they fear our enmity. Valentina Ivleva was one of those who had innocently had contact with foreigners.
I was 14 years old. The war had already started, and the convoys started to arrive. Or rather, they announced that a convoy was going to arrive, and right away there was an air raid warning, because the Germans weren't going to let that convoy through. Of course, I was very interested to see a convoy, and I went to watch the first one. It was near our house, which wasn't very far from the northern Dvina. There was a tall ladder, so I climbed that ladder up to the attic, and I had a panoramic view of it all. At first, they were maneuvering the ships in, the warships that had escorted the convoy. And of course, we were the very first people to see a convoy. When I was 15, I met Bell Rao. He was a sub-lieutenant on the ship, the Thomas Hartley. He was 20, and we had a beautiful, sweet friendship. He was teaching me English because I asked him to, and I was learning 10 words a day. We began with the verb to introduce, which is all about getting acquainted. So just imagine how I felt when I found out he was leaving. He told me we'd have to separate and that he's leaving forever. Well, naturally, I told him I'd never love anybody else in my whole life. And I also said I'd like to have his child. Do you understand what I mean? And he said to me, Valya, listen, Valya, what you are saying. First of all, I don't want my child to be without a father. Back home in the US, they treat children like that very badly. And I don't ever want my child to be called a bastard. That's what he said to me. Besides, he said, God will take care of us. He had strong religious beliefs. And then the arrests began. I was arrested in 1946 and accused of being an Anglo-American spy, though I was completely innocent. I thought there must have been some kind of misunderstanding, that it would somehow suddenly stop, a temporary hiccup. Well, that temporary hiccup lasted for 6 whole years.
Stalin has always felt himself surrounded by enemies. And now, as his ambitions inflate to match his gathering strength, his urge to oppress is given full rein. But the struggle with Hitler's empire masks Stalin's true nature from the world. Now, as Red Army offensives strike all along the front, the world's attention is still focused on Hitler's crimes, many of them waiting to be uncovered on the roads through Belorussia and the Ukraine. Overstretched and overwhelmed, retreating German forces leave the Red Army to reclaim scorched wastelands and rescue people devastated by what they have experienced. In the village of Markovnia in Belorussia, Valentina Ilkevich remembers.
While they were driving her to the hut, children were being killed in front of their mother's eyes. And all the time the Germans were enjoying themselves. This woman had 5 children, and one was a little toddler. She kept him pressed to her. I suppose she thought they could at least die together, that if they were burnt alive, she could at least comfort him. But one of the Germans sees this and makes signs to her, as if to say, toss this kid in the air, I'll shoot him. You toss him up and I'll shoot him down. And she, to deny that pleasure, do you see, she lifts up the child and smashes him to the ground herself. And it was winter, so the ground was hard. And yes, she killed him, her own little child. I couldn't help in any way, couldn't shout out or even weep, because the enemy was all around. I could only bite my hands when they herded people into a hut, poured petrol over it, and nailed the windows shut with boards. I was thinking, who could possibly raise their hand to strike a match when it would burn so many people alive? And those screams and moans still ring in my soul. Even last night, I saw that very village, Markovnia, in my dreams.
As if the stark facts are not enough to speak for themselves, survivors are filmed again and again.
There was a neighbor who came, told us that they had captured her daughter. She didn't want to be transported away. She begged them, "Don't take me away. I'll sing you a song." But they took her, together with other children, behind the school and shot them.
Across the occupied territories, evidence of the desperate daily brutality to which the war has sunk stirs deep hatred for the enemy. The Red Army and the people are fighting for a dream of peace. As yet, they are not asking whether it is the same dream as that of Joseph Stalin, but at least the war's end now comes one step closer. As the Luftwaffe slides into irreversible decline, British and American bomber fleets have become colossal armadas of four-engined machines, protected by fast, long-range fighters. It is a campaign of terror bombing which aims to destroy Hitler's empire from within. Day and night, the raids strike major cities. But Stalin has always been openly dismissive of the Western bombing effort. For 2 years, he's been demanding his allies launch a second front in France, taunting them for the delay. The launch of Operation Overlord, D-Day, has been long awaited. From June the 6th, 1944, Stalin finds it harder to justify his taunts. Although it is true that Anglo-American troops who fight their way ashore at Normandy will still face only half the number of German divisions Hitler has committed to the Eastern Front. But from the Normandy landings onwards, the Wehrmacht must defend the Reich against two massive armies approaching its frontiers, from the west and east. Now Zhukov initiates an ambitious plan for a massive offensive through Belorussia to the Polish border. In an unusual nod to his Georgian ancestry, Stalin names the operation Bagration, after the Georgian Napoleonic War general. The massive four-front offensive will thrust north and south of Vitebsk, with General Cherniakovsky striking towards Minsk. Rokossovsky clearing the Pripyat marshes and driving towards Warsaw. Massive troop concentrations back the planning. And Bagration is launched 3 years to the day after the Germans launched Barbarossa. This is the defining moment in the military struggle. After Bagration, the defeat of Hitler's armies will appear inevitable. The Soviet Union and its allies have more men, more tanks, and more aircraft than its foe. From Italy, France, and the Soviet borders, they press towards the Reich. Behind the German lines, almost 1 million Soviet partisans wreak havoc with supply lines and communications. They secure bridgeheads across rivers, so that regular troops can leapfrog natural obstacles before the Wehrmacht can turn them into lines of defense. Minsk, capital of Belorussia. The city has suffered the worst excesses of Nazi occupation, and now they must endure one last cataclysm as the Wehrmacht fights for every street. The city is liberated in early July. no more than a few stragglers escape from Minsk to join German formations further west. The rest are killed or captured. And the lightning Soviet advance has taken a heavy toll in German weapons and vehicles. Though the fate of Minsk itself stands as a stark reminder that the Wehrmacht still grants no easy victories. And though its common soldiers still fight with a remarkable Germanic courage and tenacity, it is now clearly an army in decline. In Moscow's Tverskaya Street, a parade like no others. 50,000 Germans on their way to work camps are displayed to their conquerors. The people watch in silence. Perhaps these vast columns of Hitler's humbled soldiery seem more human in defeat. And when, symbolically, the street is cleaned of their passing footprint, the Moscow crowds stream as silently away. While the Germans march on across Moscow's Crimea Bridge to the rail stations. And the cattle cars that will take them to work camps across the Soviet Union. Now Hitler's house of cards is crumbling. For the Führer, 1944 is indeed the year of nemesis. Faced with almost certain rejection in his pursuit of destiny, among the ruins of Germany's capital, Hitler finally loses the last vestiges of his fragile equilibrium and sinks into madness. He refuses to recognize the seriousness of the year's military disasters. He prefers horoscopes to military advice. Despite stark evidence of impending catastrophe all around him in Berlin, he speaks only of total victory, of the 1,000-year Reich. But if one single event is responsible for pushing Adolf Hitler beyond sanity, it is the defection of the German officer class. Now, a member of one of its leading families, Count Klaus von Stauffenberg, places a suitcase full of explosives in the conference hut at Hitler's Rastenburg headquarters. The bomb explodes less than 4 meters from the Führer. Certain that Adolf Hitler is dead, the plotters move quickly to seize control of Berlin. But incredibly, Hitler has survived the full force of the blast with barely visible injuries. He's filmed at the hospital, visiting others from the conference room who were less lucky. Proof to the German people of his extraordinary survival. Proof in his mind that he is still destiny's instrument. But he takes a savage revenge. Hundreds of suspects are arrested and tortured by the Gestapo. The trials, presided over by the notoriously rabid judge of the People's Court, Roland Freisler, are exercises in the propaganda of humiliation. Before the court are some of the most highly respected figures in non-Nazi society, Junkers. Men like Adam Trott-zu-Zoltz and Count von Schulenburg, the ambassador who had in other days overseen the Soviet-German pact. Defendant after defendant is subjected to hysterical denunciation and then sentenced to death. Hitler watches film of their executions. Some are shot, others are guillotined or hung on meat hooks, strangled with piano wire. The funeral of Field Marshal Rommel, the most senior officer implicated in the plot, is conducted with all the pomp and ceremony of the Third Reich. He has been offered the choice between a certain death sentence and a state funeral with his wife left unharmed if he chooses suicide. He has chosen to take the poison provided by the Führer's emissaries. From the Kremlin there is silence on the whole incident. No dictator views an assassination attempt, even on an enemy dictator, with total equanimity. Now, gathering momentum with the success of Bagration, the Red Army drives across the old borders of the Soviet Union into Romania. Into Bulgaria. Into Yugoslavia, liberating Belgrade alongside Tito's independent partisan army. Professor Semiriaga.
The Balkan region had always been an important region for the great powers of Europe. It had always been an object of political and economic interest to these countries. So, of course, it's no surprise that before the Second World War, the Balkans preserved its importance for the warring factions as much for the Allies as for the Axis coalition. It's well known that the British leader Churchill openly expressed the opinion that he would prefer the Second Front to be opened up in the Balkans.
But Poland, as it has always been for Stalin, is the prize. For the Polish people, Hitler's war has been an unrelieved nightmare. Penned in behind the wall of the notorious Warsaw Ghetto, Poland's Jewish population has been the victim of some of Nazis' ideology's most appalling racial experiments, target for its notions of ethnic cleansing. After years of a tenuous existence inside the ghetto, survivors rose against Hitler's extermination program in 1943. But after a month's fighting, the uprising was crushed by the SS with the utmost brutality, and the ghetto cleared. By the time the Red Army enters Poland in the summer of 1944, only a few dozen Jews remain in hiding in the capital. And it is not only Poland's Jews who suffer. Occupied and partitioned in 1939, Poland, as an entity, ceased to exist. On its territory, Germany has established most of the notorious extermination camps where Europe's Jews, gypsies, Russian prisoners are being efficiently gassed and burnt. Its national life continues only in its underground army and those forces fighting under the command of its exile government in London. Majdanek, eastern Poland, late July 1944. The first of the death camps is liberated, almost still operating, by the Red Army. The full extent of Hitler's genocidal madness is now revealed to the world, and there is worse to come, as the Red Army goes on to liberate Sobibor, Treblinka, and, most terrible of all, the great killing complex at Auschwitz. A reconnaissance paratrooper, when she was captured behind German lines, Irina Kharina has survived in Auschwitz since April 1943. Exposed to all its unique horrors, she remembers one moment above all others.
Opposite us was hut number 11. French women were being held there. Then one night, a lorry drove up and every single one of them was forced into it and brought to the crematorium. They knew that they were going to die. They knew where they were being taken to. And these doomed women were only a few hours from death, sang the Marseillaise. They sang it loudly for the whole camp to hear, and we, locked up in our hut, could only cry. It is something I will remember forever.
As Soviet forces approached the camp, she and two friends were in the last column of Russian prisoners the SS marched westwards.
One night we decided to hide in a pile of hay in the barn. In the morning, the other girls in our group began to call for us loudly by name. And that was extremely frightening, because that might have alerted the Germans to the fact that we were hiding somewhere. Another terrifying moment was when the SS soldiers came into the barn with guard dogs. To us, the sound of their machine guns finishing off exhausted stragglers was as nothing in comparison to the sound of those dogs barking in that barn. It was only years later that I discovered the dogs can't sniff people out when they're hiding in hay. But that moment was the most frightening of my life. So we waited till dark, left the barn, and set off to look for refuge in a peasant's house.
Rescued by Soviet troops, she finds to her horror she is immediately taken by the NKVD back to Auschwitz, now being used as an interrogation center.
We were interrogated about all that had happened to us, and the interrogations were very thorough, because they even wanted to know what had specifically happened on a specific day. But I have to say that Auschwitz had been full of all sorts of people. For example, there had been some girls in Auschwitz who had collaborated with the Germans and had even betrayed us to the Gestapo when we had first arrived in Smolensk. So I think it was quite right that we were all interrogated, but it didn't have to be quite so thorough. It was very harrowing being interrogated every night, and the questions were always the same. When did this happen, and when did that happen? What helped us a lot was the fact that there were 3 of us, and our evidence all coincided. So we didn't have to make anything up, because every single word of our evidence was the same. But all the same, I just couldn't believe it when the final interrogator told me I was free to resume my studies at college. I was convinced something else was going to befall me. And they did actually set us free, although they didn't give us any money or clothes for our journey. And finally, in September 1945, we got home, having hitched all the way there on goods trains.
As the advancing Soviet army clears the Germans from Poland's cities, the first massacres of political prisoners are discovered. In this city, only 6 prisoners succeeded in hiding when the rest are shot down by their retreating guards. But it is in the devastated city of Lublin that the most horrific prison massacre is found. The great castle at Lublin has housed prisoners throughout the German occupation. Now, as the Red Army enters the ruined city and Soviet units are welcomed on the streets, infantrymen break into the castle prison. In the prison tailoring room, over 600 have been shot down. The large proportion of women suggests they were machine-gunned while at work. In the courtyard, many more. Hitler as murderer, Stalin as liberator. It has been a familiar script, and one that helps conceal Stalin's own crimes against the Polish people. Crimes like the killing of 20,000 Polish army officers in 1940, a massacre for which the Soviet dictator and the Soviet system have gone to great lengths to escape widespread blame. When in 1943, German authorities discovered and exposed over 4,000 officers' graves at Katyn Forest near Smolensk, there were few in the West who believed their claim that the NKVD was responsible. The Western Allies, faced with Stalin's angry denials, accepted Soviet assertions of Nazi guilt. Despite the strength of filmed German evidence, and despite horrified protests from the anti-communist Polish government exiled in London, Stalin will never admit responsibility for Katyn. After the war, he will hide behind the USSR's own film of the bodies made in 1947. By then, the world will know the true Joseph Stalin, and few will doubt his guilt. But in the early summer of 1944, he can still wear the guise of Poland's and Eastern Europe's great liberator. The first overt signal that Stalin comes not as liberator but as conqueror is seen in late July, as General Rokossowski takes the eastern Polish city of Lublin. Within hours of the Red Flag's appearance over the city, Stalin has installed a puppet communist government, the Lublin Committee. They are invited to Moscow, where they are met by Wyszynski. Loud denunciations by nationalist Poles in London bring little response from the Allied corridors of power, and the London Polish government is powerless to prevent this theft of its constituency. But its cries will not long go unheeded. Uncle Joe Stalin is about to drop his mask and show his true face to the world. The Red Army is approaching Warsaw now, the very heart of suffering in the Second World War. On the 29th of July, Soviet radio issues a general plea to the Polish resistance movement, the Home Army. The carefully worded broadcast calls for active resistance to the occupying forces, and gives the impression, without ever directly saying so, that the Red Army is about to storm the city. The Home Army, though gathered for a rural campaign, answers what it sees as a clarion call from its ally in full measure. And on the 1st of August, battle erupts once more on the streets of Warsaw. At first, the rising takes the German garrison by surprise, and the insurgents seize large parts of the city. But they need help before German reinforcements arrive. Surely the Red Army can attack now, or at least send much-needed weapons and supplies. But the Red Army does not move from its positions just east of the city. And Stalin, oblivious to mounting pressure from Western leaders, grimly rejects Churchill's request for the use of Soviet airfields for RAF planes dropping supplies. Without help, the Poles are doomed. SS units under General Bakselewski are dispatched to Warsaw to put down the rising. Hopelessly outgunned, the Home Army fights for every building, clings to every strong point, vainly awaiting salvation from the east. The battle for the city rages all through August and into September. But gradually, inevitably, the Polish resistance movement is decimated.
Была причина в том, что Сталин сказал, что он не хочет иметь ничего общего с этой Варшавской войной.
It was out of political considerations that Stalin did not want to help the uprising. It was an uprising which was obviously in conflict with the interests of the Soviet Union and the so-called Lublin Committee of National Salvation. But purely from a military point of view, the Warsaw insurgents were heroically and courageously fighting the Germans for the freedom of their homeland. So in this sense, they were not our enemies, but our allies. However, from the political point of view, unfortunately, everything was the wrong way round. But still, something could have been done if Stalin had only had the political will to do so.
Stalin bows to international criticism only in September, when an increase in Soviet aid comes too late. The last Home Army survivors surrender in early October. By the time the Red Army finally occupies Warsaw's ruins in January 1945, 300,000 Poles have died in the city since August. If Stalin's purpose has been to engineer the destruction of nationalist armed force in Poland, it has succeeded completely. But events in Warsaw have set in motion a transformation of British and American attitudes towards their ally. From now on, they will scrutinize Stalin's motives with new suspicion. From now on, Stalin must fight yet another war, this time a secret, silent battle against his own allies. It is a battle quickly joined on both sides. British Prime Minister Churchill visits Moscow in October, and he has come to discuss the fate of Eastern Europe. Churchill is already deeply suspicious of Stalin's post-war intentions, but he is a realist too. And he knows that there is little that Britain or even the United States can do to stop a man whose ambitions are backed by Red Army occupation.
Churchill's position was a most paradoxical one. As one of the Allied leaders, he had won. He was a winner, but a winner with a disintegrating empire. And as a serious and far-sighted politician, he knew this.
And so the two leaders reach a pragmatic agreement. Jotted down on a piece of scrap paper, it concedes Soviet control over Bulgaria, Hungary and Romania in return for Stalin's guarantee of non-intervention in Greek politics. The future of Yugoslavia is left open, and Stalin refuses even to discuss Poland. But the Polish question, on which Britain went to war in 1939, will not go away. And it dominates the next round of Stalin's secret struggle against his allies at Yalta in the Crimea in February 1945. At Yalta, Stalin meets Roosevelt for the last time. Sick man, close to death, the American president is determined to recruit Stalin to the war against Japan and dismisses Churchill's fear of Soviet expansionism. Deliberately marginalizing the British leader, Stalin promises to fight Japan after Germany is beaten and is again able to deflect all attempts to solve the Polish problem. While the conference proceeds to drafting a joint demand for Germany's unconditional surrender, the rest of Eastern Europe is hardly even discussed. Now, as Stalin takes his leave of Allied leaders, his smile is the smile of the tiger. And as head of state, Kalinin pins on Stalin a self-awarded medal. It is accompanied by a letter begging for his wife's release. But she remains at forced labor. Soviet troops are now firmly in place in several European states beyond the Soviet border, in Romania, Bulgaria, and, most importantly, in Poland. These are prizes Joseph Stalin will not forego, and there seems now little doubt that his allies, through impotence or indifference, will allow him freedom to take whatever he chooses.